Hello, and welcome back to Bedtime and Historian. On a cold night a few days before Christmas, in the year 1144, the walls of a city that had stood as a Christian stronghold for nearly half a century cracked open and fell inward. Inside were merchants and priests and ordinary families, not soldiers. Outside was an army led by a man the East had learned to fear. What happened over the next 4 years would pull a pope, a famous monk, 2 kings, and tens of thousands of people across an entire continent, and almost none of it would unfold the way they intended. If you enjoy these quiet journeys through history, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, leave your location and your local time down in the comments. It helps other restless, sleepless people find their way to this little corner of the night, and there is something comforting in knowing that strangers in faraway cities are settling in for the very same story you are. So get comfortable, let your shoulders go heavy, and let yourself drift slowly into the long, strange, and very human story of the Second Crusade. Our story begins not with a king or a saint, but with a city in the dust of the upper Euphrates. Edessa was an old place, far older than the men who held it. It had been a centre of Christian learning for centuries before any Westerner ever saw it, a city of Armenians and Syriac Christians, of scholars and traders, sitting on the edge of the Great Plains, where Asia opened up toward Persia. When the Knights of the First Crusade had come east, almost 50 years earlier, one of their leaders had taken Edessa quietly, more by welcome than by siege, and the County of Edessa had become the first of the Crusader states. It was also the most exposed. It sat far out beyond the others, like a man standing a long way in front of his friends, with his back to a very large crowd. By the 1140s, the man who held Edessa was Count Jocelyn II. He was not a foolish man, but he was not a careful one either. He had quarrelled with his neighbours, especially with the rulers of Antioch, and he had let his friendships go cold at exactly the moment he needed them most. He also preferred to live in his comfortable fortress at Turbessel, west of the Euphrates River, rather than inside Edessa itself. So when the danger came, the Count was somewhere else entirely, which is a habit that tends to age badly. The danger had a name. Imad ad-Din Zengi was the ruler of Mosul and Aleppo, 2 of the most important cities of Muslim Syria and Iraq, and for years he had been doing something that no one had managed in a long time. He had been pulling the scattered, quarrelling Muslim lords of the region into something closer to a single force. The Muslim world the first Crusaders had faced had been deeply divided, city against city, prince against prince, and that division was the real reason a few thousand Westerners had been able to carve out kingdoms at all. Zengi understood this better than anyone. He spent his life pressing those quarrelling lords together, sometimes with alliance, more often with the sword. In the autumn of 1144, Zengi learned that Jocelyn had marched away from Edessa with most of his fighting men. The Count had gone off to support an ally elsewhere, leaving the great city in the hands of its citizens. There was no real garrison. The defence rested on the townspeople and on the local clergy, with the Armenian and Latin bishops trying to hold things together. Zengi moved fast. He brought his army across the country and threw it around the walls of Edessa late in November. What followed was a siege in the oldest sense. Zengi had engineers, men who understood how to bring down stone. While his soldiers kept the defenders busy on the ramparts, his sappers dug beneath the foundations of a tower, hollowing out the earth and propping the tunnel with timber. The people of Edessa fought as best they could. They had courage, but courage does not hold up a wall that is being eaten away from below. Messengers slipped out to beg Jocelyn to come, and to beg the Prince of Antioch to come, and to beg the King of Jerusalem far to the south. But help was distant, the roads were long, and Zengi gave them no time. On the 24th of December, 1144, the sappers set fire to the timbers in their tunnel. The supports burned through, the earth gave way, and a long section of the wall came crashing down. Zengi's men poured through the gap. The fighting in the streets was brief and terrible. The Latin Christians, the Westerners, were killed or taken as slaves. Crowds of people fled toward the citadel, the inner fortress, hoping the gates would open and shelter them, but the press of bodies at the gate became a crush, and many were trampled or smothered there before they could get inside. The old Armenian archbishop was among the dead. The citadel itself held out only a little longer before it too surrendered. Zengi, it should be said, was not careless with his prize. He had no wish to rule an empty ruin, so he ordered that the native Eastern Christians, the Armenians and Syriac people who had lived there for generations, be spared and allowed to stay, since the city would need inhabitants. It was the Westerners, the foreigners, who were the target. Edessa, the first of the Crusader states, the proud city far out in front, had fallen in a matter of weeks. When the news travelled west, it crossed the sea slowly, carried in letters, and by frightened travellers, and everywhere it landed it caused alarm. For 2 generations the Christian kingdoms in the east had seemed, to people in France and Germany and Italy, like a permanent fact. Jerusalem was in Christian hands. The holy places could be visited. Pilgrims went and came back. The capture of Edessa shattered that comfortable picture. If the first of the eastern states could fall, then so could the others, and behind them lay Jerusalem itself. It is worth pausing here to understand why this single city mattered so much, because the answer says a great deal about the age. The men and women of Western Europe in the 12th century lived inside a world that was deeply, completely religious. The recovery of Jerusalem by the First Crusade had been understood not as a military event, but as a sign of God's favour, proof that heaven smiled on their efforts. The loss of Edessa, then, was not simply a defeat on a distant frontier. To devout people it felt like a withdrawal of that favour, a warning, even a punishment for the sins of Christendom. That feeling, more than any map or any strategy, is what would soon set the whole of Europe in motion. But all of that lay in the future. On that cold night at the end of 1144, none of the kings of Europe yet knew their lives were about to change. Zengi rode through a conquered city. Jocelyn sat in his comfortable fortress with the worst news of his life on its way to him. And far to the west, in a stone church in France, a thin and sickly monk who would soon set fire to the imagination of a continent had not yet been told that he had a part to play. To understand how a fallen city on the edge of the world could move millions, we first have to look at the strange, beautiful and precarious little kingdoms that the Crusaders had built, and at just how lightly they held the land beneath their feet. The fragile kingdoms of Outremer. To the people who lived in France and Germany, the lands the Crusaders had won had a simple name. They called them Outremer, which means, plainly, the land beyond the sea. It was a fitting name, because for most Westerners that is exactly what those kingdoms were. They were a rumour across the water, a place you heard about in sermons and pilgrim songs, a strip of holy country on the far side of the Mediterranean, where Christian lords now ruled in sight of the places named in Scripture. Very few people who spoke of Outremer had ever seen it. Fewer still understood how thin and how anxious life there really was. The First Crusade had ended almost 50 years before our story, with the capture of Jerusalem in 1099. Out of that bloody and improbable success, 4 small states had taken shape along the eastern shore of the sea. Farthest north and east was the County of Edessa, the exposed outpost whose fall we have already seen. Below it sat the Principality of Antioch, gathered around one of the great ancient cities of the world. Further south came the County of Tripoli, clinging to its coast and its mountains. And at the heart of it all, the prize that gave the whole enterprise its meaning, lay the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Look at these states on a map, and the first thing you notice is how strange their shape is. They were not broad kingdoms with deep, safe interiors. They were a long, narrow ribbon of territory pressed against the coastline, hundreds of miles from top to bottom, but often only a day or two's ride from the sea to the frontier. Behind that frontier rose mountains and stretched deserts, and beyond those lay the great Muslim cities of Aleppo, Damascus, Mosul and Cairo, each of them larger and richer than anything the Crusaders held. The Christian lords lived, in effect, on a balcony with their backs to the wall and a very crowded street below. What held this ribbon together was stone. The Crusaders were among the most determined castle builders the world has ever seen, and the land filled up with their fortresses. They placed castles to guard mountain passes, to watch river crossings, to overlook the roads that pilgrims and merchants used, and to keep an eye on the borders where raiders might slip through. Some of these were modest towers, others grew into vast strongholds, ringed with walls and built to hold a small garrison against a far larger force for months at a time. The whole system rested on a hard truth. The Franks, as the local people called all the Westerners regardless of where they actually came from, were never numerous enough to win a war by sheer numbers. They had to fight from behind walls and choose their battles with great care. Much of that careful, patient defending fell to a new kind of man who had appeared in these decades, the warrior monk. The military orders, above all the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, were brotherhoods of men who took religious vows of poverty and obedience, and then spent their lives fighting and guarding rather than praying in quiet cloisters. The Templars had begun in a very small way, just a handful of knights who took it upon themselves to protect pilgrims on the dangerous roads, and they took their name from their first home in Jerusalem, the buildings on the Temple Mount. Within a few decades, these orders had become some of the most disciplined and reliable soldiers in the East, and they came to hold many of the strongest castles, because unlike ordinary lords, they did not die out, marry away their lands, or lose interest. The order simply went on. Beneath the lords and the warrior monks lived everyone else, and here the picture grows more complicated than the sermons back home ever admitted. The Frankish rulers were a thin layer at the top of a society made up mostly of people who were not Frankish at all. There were Eastern Christians of many kinds, Armenians and Syriac and Greek. There were Muslims, who in many places remained the majority of the farmers and townsfolk. There were Jewish communities in the cities, and there were merchants from a dozen lands. The Crusaders had come to conquer, but having conquered, they had to live, and living meant a daily arrangement with the very people they had set out to fight. Many Franks of the second and third generation, men born in the East, spoke Arabic, ate the local food, kept cooler Eastern houses, and looked with quiet bewilderment at the rough, overdressed newcomers who kept arriving from Europe, convinced that everything was simple. The lifeline that connected this odd society to the Western world ran by sea, and it was held in the hands of the Italian merchant cities. Genoa, Pisa, and Venice owned the ships that carried pilgrims and soldiers east and brought back the spices, silks, and sugar that made the trade so profitable. In exchange for their fleets, these cities had bargained hard, winning their own quarters in the coastal towns, their own markets, and a healthy share of the customs duties. Without their ships, the Crusader states could not have been supplied or reinforced at all, and the Italians knew it, and they charged accordingly. At the centre of this fragile arrangement sat the kingdom of Jerusalem and its crown. In the years just before Edessa fell, that crown had passed through difficult hands. King Fulk, an able and experienced ruler who had come from the west to marry into the royal line, had died in a hunting accident in 1143, thrown from his horse while chasing a hare. He left behind his widow, Queen Melisende, a strong-willed and capable woman of the royal house, and their young son, Baldwin III, who was still a boy. Power in Jerusalem therefore rested with the queen and her council, while the boy king grew toward the age when he would want to rule in his own right, a tension that would matter a great deal later on. And then there was the problem that ran through everything, the problem of the Crusader states quarrelling among themselves. They were supposed to be brothers in a shared cause, but they behaved much like any collection of ambitious lords anywhere. The rulers of Antioch and the counts of Edessa had feuded. Jerusalem and Antioch eyed each other warily. Each prince guarded his own borders and his own interests, and a threat to one was not always treated as a threat to all. This was the deeper weakness behind the fall of Edessa. Jocelyn had been left to face Zengi largely alone, not because no one could have helped, but because the help that might have come was busy nursing old grudges. For half a century the Crusaders had survived all of this. The thin lands, the small numbers, the long supply lines, and their own divisions, for one simple reason. Their enemies had been even more divided than they were. As long as Aleppo fought Damascus and Mosul fought everyone, the Christian ribbon along the coast could hold. The Crusader states were not strong. They were merely lucky in their neighbours, and luck is a poor wall to stand behind. What made the 1140s so dangerous, and what made the loss of Edessa more than a single defeat, was that the luck was beginning to run out. In the cities of the East, a new pattern was forming, the slow gathering of Muslim power under a single will. That gathering had begun with the man who took Edessa, and to understand the storm about to break over Europe, we must look more closely at him, and at the cooler, harder son who would inherit his work, Zengi, then his son. The man who had brought down Edessa did not look, at first glance, like the figure who would reshape the East. Imad ad-Din Zengi had been born into a hard schooling. His father had governed Aleppo for the Seljuk Turks, the great dynasty that ruled much of the Muslim world in those years, and his father had been executed when Zengi was only a small child, caught on the wrong side of one of the endless quarrels among the Turkish princes. The boy grew up in Mosul under the protection of its rulers, and he learned early the lesson that the politics of his world taught again and again. Loyalty was temporary, mercy was rarely repaid, and a man who wished to survive made himself feared. Zengi rose through service to the Seljuk overlords, proving himself a capable and reliable commander at a time when reliability was in short supply. In reward, he was made Atabeg, a kind of guardian and governor of Mosul, and from that base he reached out and took Aleppo as well. With those two cities under one hand, he held the spine of northern Syria and Iraq, and he set about the work that would occupy the rest of his life, which was the pressing together of the region's many small powers into something he could command. He was, by every account that survives, a formidable and frightening man. He kept iron discipline in his armies, and his soldiers feared him more than they feared the enemy, which was rather the point. It was said that when his troops marched through farmland, the crops were left untouched, because no man dared to plunder without his order. This was not gentleness. It was control so complete that the fields of strangers were safer than the cup beside his own bed. He treated rival Muslim lords and Christian lords alike as obstacles to be removed, and he spent far more of his career fighting fellow Muslims than fighting the Franks. The capture of Edessa, which terrified Europe, was to Zengi only one campaign among many in his long project of gathering power. He did not live to enjoy that famous victory for long. In the late summer of 1146, Zengi was campaigning along the Euphrates, besieging a fortress that belonged, as it happened, to other Muslim rivals. One night in his camp he discovered one of his own servants, a slave, drinking the wine he had set aside, and he flew into a rage and threatened the man with death. The slave, with nothing left to lose and a long night ahead, waited until his master had fallen into a drunken sleep and then killed him in his tent. So ended the great Zengi, not on a battlefield and not by a crusader's sword, but at the hand of a frightened servant over a cup of stolen wine. It is one of the small ironies of history that the man who kept whole armies in line could not keep order in his own tent. The death of a great conqueror is always a dangerous moment, because everything he has held together by force tends to fly apart the instant the force is gone. Zengi's lands did indeed divide. His elder son took Mosul and the eastern territories. His second son took Aleppo and the western lands that faced the Crusaders most directly. That second son was named Nur ad-Din, and it is no exaggeration to say that he was the most important man the Second Crusade would ever fight, though hardly anyone in Europe had heard his name when they set out. Nur ad-Din was cut from different cloth than his father. Where Zengi had ruled by terror and appetite, the son ruled by patience and a deep, sincere religious devotion. He was disciplined in his personal life to the point of severity, simple in his habits, and known for a reputation of justice that drew people to his side. He did not drink. he prayed. He surrounded himself with scholars and holy men, and he took up an idea that his father had used only as a tool and made it the centre of his life. That idea was jihad, the call to drive the Christian invaders out of Muslim lands, framed not as one lord's ambition, but as a sacred duty binding on all. By turning the war against the Crusaders into a religious cause, Nur ad-Din gave the divided Muslims of Syria something they had badly lacked, a reason to unite that was larger than any single prince. This was a more dangerous weapon than any siege engine, and the Crusaders would be slow to understand it. Almost as soon as he took Aleppo, Nur ad-Din was given a chance to prove himself, and the chance came from Edessa once again. When word of Zengi's death reached the west, Count Jocelyn II, who had lost the city through his own absence, saw an opening. The native Armenian Christians inside Edessa still resented their new Muslim masters, and they secretly agreed to open the gates to him. Late in the year, Jocelyn slipped into Edessa with a small force and the welcome of much of the population. For a brief moment it seemed the lost county might be recovered. It was a fatal mistake. Jocelyn had men enough to enter the city, but not nearly enough to hold it, and worst of all, he could not take the citadel, the strong inner fortress, which remained in the hands of Nur ad-Din's garrison. He had walked into a trap of his own making. Nur ad-Din marched at once with his army, and Jocelyn found himself caught between the citadel above and the relieving force outside the walls. There was no real battle, only a collapse. The Franks tried to flee back the way they had come, and in the panic and the crush at the gates, large numbers were cut down. Jocelyn himself escaped, but the city did not. This second fall of Edessa, late in 1146, was far worse than the first. Zengi had spared the native Christians because he wanted a working city. Nur ad-Din, faced with a population that had just betrayed his garrison and welcomed his enemy, showed no such restraint. The city was given over to slaughter and plunder. The Armenian Christians who had opened the gates were punished without mercy, and Edessa, one of the oldest Christian cities in the world, was effectively destroyed as a living community. Its walls were pulled down, its people were killed, enslaved, or scattered. What had been a great centre of trade and learning became a broken shell, and it would never again be a Christian stronghold. So, within the space of 2 years, the County of Edessa had not merely fallen once, but been crushed twice, the second time so thoroughly that there was nothing left to argue over. The lesson was not lost on anyone in the East. The old game, in which the Crusaders survived by playing one Muslim city against another, was ending. A single will, young, patient, and certain of its purpose, was rising in Aleppo, and that will intended to push the Franks into the sea. The news of all this took time to travel, and it travelled in pieces, growing more alarming with each retelling. By the time the full weight of it settled over the courts and monasteries of Europe, the simple, comfortable belief that the Holy Land would always be Christian had been replaced by a cold fear that it might soon be lost entirely. That fear needed a voice and an answer, and a man with the authority to summon Christendom to action. That man sat in Rome, on the throne of St. Peter, and he had only recently and reluctantly become Pope at all. It is to him, and to the letter that set everything in motion, that we now turn. The letter from Rome. The man whose word could summon armies had not wanted the job. Early in 1145, the cardinals of the church had gathered to choose a new pope, and their choice fell on a quiet Cistercian monk, an abbot of no great fame, who took the name Eugenius III. He was a gentle and unworldly figure, more at home in the simple routine of a monastery than in the snake pit of Roman politics, and his elevation surprised no one more than it surprised him. Here is a small detail that says much about the age. Eugenius was the first member of the Cistercian order ever to become pope, and he had once been a student and follower of Bernard of Clairvaux, the most famous monk in Europe. So now the former pupil sat on the throne of St. Peter, while the old master remained an abbot, and before long the abbot would be doing the pope's preaching for him. Eugenius had little chance to settle in, because Rome itself was in revolt. The citizens of the city had thrown off papal rule and set up a commune, a self-governing council inspired by memories of the ancient Roman Republic and stirred up by a fiery preacher who denounced the wealth and worldly power of the church. The new pope found his own capital closed to him, and he spent much of his reign moving among the towns of central Italy and France, a pope without a Rome. It was from this wandering, uncertain position that he received the news from the east, the news that the County of Edessa had fallen and then been destroyed, and that the whole Christian presence in the Holy Land now looked dangerously thin. For a pope, even a reluctant one, the response was almost obvious. 50 years earlier, Pope Urban II had called the First Crusade and set in motion the very enterprise that was now in danger. The recovery of Jerusalem had been the great glory of the papacy in living memory. To let the Holy Land slip away on Eugenius's watch was unthinkable. And so, on the first day of December in 1145, the new pope issued a formal letter, a papal bull, calling for a fresh expedition to the east. It was addressed in the first instance to the King of France and to the French nobility and people, for it was the French who had led the First Crusade, and the French who were expected to lead again. The letter is known by its opening words, which mean roughly how greatly our predecessors. Eugenius began by reminding his readers of what their own fathers and grandfathers had done, how an earlier generation had marched east, suffered, and won Jerusalem for Christendom, and how shameful it would be for the sons to let that inheritance be lost. This was a clever appeal, because it framed the new crusade not as a strange or frightening adventure, but as a debt of honour owed to the past, a chance for the living to prove themselves worthy of the dead. But the letter did more than appeal to pride. It laid out, more clearly and completely than any document before it, the bargain that the Church was offering. Any man who took the cross and went to fight in the East with a pure heart would receive the remission of his sins, the wiping clean of the spiritual debt he had built up over a lifetime. This was the indulgence, and to a medieval mind, fearful of judgment and certain of hell, it was an offer of immense value. The hardships of the journey, the danger of death, the years away from home, all of these were set against the promise that a man might wash away the weight of his every wrongdoing in a single act of holy service. Alongside the spiritual reward came a set of very practical protections, and these mattered more than later readers often realize. A man who went on crusade, left his lands, his family, and his fortune behind for years, exposed to every grasping neighbour. So the letter declared that the property and families of crusaders would be placed under the protection of the Church while they were away. Their debts would be suspended, and no interest would accumulate on what they owed. Lawsuits against them would be frozen until their return. In effect, the Church promised to freeze a man's worldly affairs in place so that he could go and fight without ruining himself. For a knight tempted by the spiritual reward but terrified of the practical cost, this was the assurance that made the whole thing possible. This was, in many ways, the moment the crusade became a settled institution rather than a single wild eruption of enthusiasm. The First Crusade had been a chaotic, half-improvised affair, and much of its theology had been worked out on the march. Now the papacy had a tested formula, a standard set of promises and protections that could be offered again and again. Eugenius was, without quite intending to be, writing the rule book for the next several centuries of holy war. Yet a letter, however well crafted, is only ink on parchment until someone carries its message into the hearts of living people. Eugenius understood his own limits. He was a careful administrator, not a thunderous preacher, and he was stuck in Italy wrestling with the rebels of Rome. He needed a voice, and there was only one voice in all of Europe equal to the task. He turned to his old teacher, Bernard of Clairvaux, and gave him the authority to preach the crusade across France and beyond. It was a decision that would shape everything that followed, for Bernard would throw himself into the work with a fervour that no pope could have matched, and would carry the call far further than Eugenius had ever intended. There was, as it happened, already a king waiting to listen. Louis VII of France was a young man, pious to the point of monkishness, more devout than was perhaps wise in a ruler. He had come to the throne almost by accident, after the death of an elder brother, and he carried his crown with a heavy and anxious conscience. A few years before, in a brutal little war against one of his vassals, his soldiers had set fire to a town called Vitry, and the flames had spread to the church where hundreds of townspeople had taken shelter. More than 1,000 men, women, and children had burned to death inside it. The horror of that day never left Louis. He believed he had a great sin to answer for, and he had already begun to think of a journey to the Holy Land as the act that might cleanse him. So when Louis gathered his nobles at his Christmas court late in 1145 and announced his wish to march east, the desire was sincere and personal as much as it was political, but the announcement fell oddly flat. His barons were unmoved. A long, expensive expedition to the far side of the world, in answer to bad news about a city most of them had never heard of, did not stir them, and a king cannot crusade alone. The idea hung in the air, half-spoken, lacking the spark that would turn private devotion into a national movement. That spark was on its way. Bernard of Clairvaux now held the Pope's commission, and Bernard was not a man who failed to move a crowd. The stage was being set for one of the most extraordinary scenes of the age, a gathering on a hillside in Burgundy, where a frail and aging monk would stand before a sea of people and, by the sheer force of his words, send a king and a kingdom on their way to war. To that hillside, and to the strange and powerful figure at the centre of it, we now go. The voice at Vézelay. To understand what happened on the hillside, you first have to understand the man who stood at the top of it, because there was no one else in Europe quite like Bernard of Clairvaux. He was the abbot of a Cistercian monastery in Burgundy, a house he had built up from nothing into the heart of a fast-spreading religious movement. From that quiet base he had become, without holding any high office, the single most powerful voice in Western Christendom. Popes asked his advice. Kings sought his blessing and feared his disapproval. He had settled a disputed papal election, hunted down ideas he judged heretical, and written works of devotion that were copied across the continent. He did all of this from the position of a simple abbot, which only added to his authority, because he could not be accused of seeking power for himself. He was also, in body, a wreck. Years of extreme fasting and self-denial had left him thin, pale, and chronically ill, his stomach ruined by a lifetime of eating almost nothing. He looked less like a leader of armies than like a man already half departed from the world, and yet when he spoke, something happened that no description has ever quite captured. People wept. People shouted. People who had walked into a gathering with no intention of changing their lives walked out having pledged everything. He had a gift, and in the spring of 1146 the Pope had pointed that gift at the whole of France. The Great Assembly was called for the 31st of March at the hill town of Vézelay in Burgundy, where the abbey church held relics said to belong to Mary Magdalene and drew pilgrims from far away. So many people came that the town could not hold them. They overflowed the streets and spilled out beyond the walls, until it was clear that no building on earth would contain the crowd. So a wooden platform was raised on the slope of the hill outside the town, in the open air, where the gathered thousands could see the speakers and hear the words carried down to them on the spring wind. King Louis VII was there, and he had already made his decision public by taking the cross, the act of sewing a cloth cross onto one's garment as a sign of the vow to go on crusade. Beside the king stood his queen, Eleanor of Aquitaine, a young woman who ruled in her own right one of the largest and richest territories in France, the Duchy of Aquitaine in the south. The presence of the king and queen together, ready to depart, gave the whole occasion the weight of a royal undertaking rather than a mere sermon. Then Bernard climbed onto the platform and began to speak. We do not have his exact words, but we know their effect, and the effect was overwhelming. He told the crowd of the danger to the holy places, of the loss in the east, of the chance, here and now, to win the forgiveness of every sin through a single great act of service. He pressed on the very feelings the Pope's letter had aimed at: the debt owed to the heroes of the First Crusade, the shame of standing idle, the glory and the safety of the soul that waited for those who went. And the crowd answered him not with polite agreement, but with a roar. They began to cry out for crosses, demanding the cloth tokens that mark the vow, pressing forward to take them. Bernard had brought a supply of cloth crosses, prepared in advance, and they were gone almost at once, swallowed up by the sheer number of people clamouring for them. So, the story goes, he tore strips from his own monastic habit and handed those out, and when those ran out, others tore up cloth to keep pace with the demand. It is one of the few moments in this whole history where the official record and the popular legend agree that the supply of crosses simply could not keep up with the hunger of the crowd. Men who had come as spectators left as soldiers of the cross. By the end of the day, a vast number of nobles, knights, and ordinary folk had committed themselves to the journey. This was the spark that the king's lukewarm Christmas announcement had lacked. What Louis could not do by royal command, Bernard did by the force of his preaching. From Vézelay the enthusiasm rolled outward across France. Great lords took the cross: the Count of Flanders, the Count of Toulouse, the king's own brother, and many others pledged themselves. Bishops and ordinary parish priests carried the message into their towns and villages. The whole machinery of the church, the pulpits and the processions and the relics, was turned toward a single purpose, and the country began, slowly, to prepare for war on the far side of the world. Bernard did not stop at France. The Pope had given him a wide commission, and Bernard, once moving, was hard to stop. He sent out letters in great numbers, urging lords and churchmen everywhere to join the cause. And he set out himself to preach in person across the eastern lands of France and into the German-speaking territories of the empire. Everywhere he went, the same scenes repeated. Crowds gathered, the preaching took hold, and men came forward to take the cross. He was, in the language of the time, the engine of the whole movement, and he believed with his whole heart that he was doing the work of God. There is something worth pausing over in all of this, because it tells us how the medieval mind actually worked. To us, looking back, a crusade can seem like a calculated act of policy, the projection of power into a distant region. But to the people on that hillside it was nothing of the kind. It was, first and last, a matter of the soul. The knight who took the cross was not chiefly thinking about strategy or trade routes, or the balance of power in Syria. He was thinking about his own death, which in that age came early and often, and about what waited for him beyond it. The crusade offered him a path through the terror of judgment, a way to die in a state of grace with all his sins forgiven. That promise, far more than any worldly ambition, is what filled the roads of France with armed pilgrims. Bernard understood this completely, and he played upon it with the skill of a man who had spent his whole life thinking about the fate of souls. But enthusiasm, once unleashed, is a difficult thing to steer. Bernard had set in motion something larger than a single army, a wave of religious feeling that would soon break out in directions he had never planned, against enemies he had never named, in lands far from Jerusalem. Even as he preached, the movement was beginning to take on a life of its own, with all the dangers that implies, and his next great task lay to the east, in the German lands, where the most powerful ruler in Europe had so far shown no interest at all in taking the cross. Winning that ruler over would prove harder than rousing the crowd at Vézelay, and along the way Bernard would have to confront a darker side of the very passions he had stirred. For the same preaching that filled men with holy purpose could, in the wrong mouths, turn into something murderous, and that danger was already gathering along the river Rhine. A king and a warning. The crusade now had a king, a cause, and a wave of enthusiasm rolling across France. What it did not yet have was the involvement of the most powerful realm in Central Europe, the German lands of the Empire, and Bernard set his sights on winning them. The man he had to convince was Conrad III, the German king, head of the Hohenstaufen family, and ruler in name of a vast collection of duchies, cities, and quarrelling nobles stretching from the Rhine deep into Italy. He held the title of King of the Romans, the stepping stone to being crowned emperor, though that final crown had so far eluded him. Conrad had every reason to say no. His kingdom was anything but peaceful. He was locked in a long rivalry with the rival house of Welf, a feud that ran through German politics like a fault line and could break into open war the moment his back was turned. To leave for the east would mean abandoning his realm to its own divisions for years, with no certainty he would return to find a throne. When Bernard first raised the matter, Conrad declined. He listened, he respected the abbot, but he had a kingdom to hold together, and he would not be moved by general appeals to piety. Bernard did not give up. He understood that Conrad would not be won by arguments about Edessa or strategy in Syria. He would have to be reached in a different way, struck directly in the conscience. The chance came at the king's Christmas court, held at the city of Speyer at the end of 1146. There, before the assembled nobles of the realm, Bernard preached, and at the climax of his sermon he did something audacious. He spoke as though he were Christ himself, addressing the king at the Last Judgment, asking him face to face what more God could possibly have done for him, what gifts of power and wealth and honour he had been given, and demanding to know how he would answer for having done nothing with them in God's service. It was a calculated blow, aimed straight at the fear that lived in every medieval ruler, the fear of standing before God with an account that did not balance. And it worked. Conrad, overcome, broke down and declared that he would take the cross. The hall erupted. The German nobility, following their king, came forward in great numbers to take the vow, and among them was Conrad's young nephew Frederick, a man who would one day become one of the most famous of all medieval emperors. In a single afternoon, Bernard had transformed the venture. It was no longer a French expedition. It was a joint undertaking of the two greatest powers of the Latin West, France and the Empire marching together, the largest mobilization Christendom had attempted since the First Crusade. This was Bernard's triumph, and it was real, but the same preaching that filled kings and nobles with holy resolve had, lower down, set loose something far uglier, and Bernard now had to turn and confront the consequences of the passions he had stirred. For the call to war against the enemies of Christ in the distant east had been twisted, in the minds of some, into a call to attack the supposed enemies of Christ close at hand. Along the river Rhine, in the great cities of Cologne, Mainz, Worms and Speyer, lived old and established Jewish communities, and a current of violent feeling was building against them. The Crusaders' world had seen this horror before. 50 years earlier, during the First Crusade, mobs in these very same Rhineland cities had turned on their Jewish neighbours and killed them in large numbers, robbing and slaughtering before ever setting out for the east. Now, as the new crusade was preached, the same poison rose again. At its centre this time was a renegade monk named Radolf, a Cistercian like Bernard himself, who had taken to preaching on his own authority among the Rhineland crowds. His message was simple and deadly. Why, he asked, should men travel 1,000 miles to fight unbelievers abroad while leaving unbelievers untouched at home? He turned the religious fervour of the moment into a weapon, and where he preached, attacks on Jewish communities followed. When word of this reached Bernard, he reacted with real alarm and real anger, and his response is one of the few unambiguously creditable episodes in the whole story. He held firmly to the official teaching of the Church which, whatever its other failings toward Jewish people, insisted that they were not to be killed. According to that doctrine, the Jews were to be allowed to live among Christians as a living testimony, and to murder them was a grave sin. Bernard wrote sharp letters denouncing Radolf's preaching, insisting that the Jews must not be harmed, their property not seized, their lives not taken, and when letters did not suffice, he went in person. Bernard travelled to the Rhineland and confronted Radolf directly. In front of the crowds the renegade had stirred up. He rebuked him, reminded everyone that an unauthorized monk had no business preaching at all, and ordered Radolf to return to his monastery and stay there. The force of Bernard's reputation was such that Radolf obeyed, and the worst of the incitement collapsed once its preacher was silenced. Violence did not vanish entirely, and Jewish communities in the region still suffered fear, extortion, and scattered attacks during these months. But the great massacres that had marked the First Crusade were largely prevented this time, and some of the very Jewish chroniclers who recorded these terrible events gave Bernard credit for it, naming him as the man whose intervention had saved many of their people from death. It is a strange and revealing corner of the story. The same man whose preaching had whipped up the emotional storm was also the man who rode out to contain its most dangerous overflow. He saw no contradiction in this. To Bernard, the crusade was a sacred war against a defined enemy in a defined place, and the murder of Jews at home was both a sin and a perversion of that purpose. The crowds he had inspired did not always draw such careful lines, and the gap between the leader's intention and the followers' passions would prove to be a recurring feature of the whole enterprise. With Conrad committed and the Rhineland brought back under some measure of control, the shape of the great expedition began to firm up. 2 royal armies would march east, one French and one German, by land across Europe, through the Balkans and the territory of the Byzantine Emperor, and on into Asia toward the Holy Land. It would be an undertaking of staggering scale, tens of thousands of fighting men and far more non-combatants moving thousands of miles overland. The logistics alone were enough to give a careful planner sleepless nights, and as we will see, careful planning was not the expedition's strongest quality. But here the story takes an unexpected turn, because the crusade that Bernard had preached did not, in the end, point in a single direction. The wave of enthusiasm he had raised was so broad that it could not be confined to the road to Jerusalem at all. Other men, in other corners of Europe, looked at the indulgence on offer and at the enemies nearest to them, and they asked whether they too might win the same spiritual reward without ever going east at all. Out of that question grew 2 further campaigns, one along the cold rivers and forests of the Baltic against the pagan peoples there, and one in the sunlit kingdoms of Spain and Portugal against the Muslims of the Western Mediterranean. The Second Crusade was about to become not 1 war but 3, and we turn next to those quieter fronts that history too often forgets. 2 quieter wars. Bernard had set out to send an army to Jerusalem, and he had succeeded beyond all expectation. But enthusiasm is not a tame thing. Once the idea took hold that a man could win the great spiritual reward by fighting the enemies of his faith, people across Europe began to look around at the enemies nearest to them and to wonder whether the journey east was strictly necessary. Why cross half the world to fight unbelievers in Syria when there were unbelievers, or at least unwelcome neighbours, much closer to home? Out of that very practical line of thinking, the single crusade Bernard had preached split into 3 separate wars, fought in 3 different corners of the continent against 3 different enemies. The most surprising of these split off in the north, among the Saxon nobles of Germany. When Bernard came preaching the crusade in their lands, many of these lords were distinctly unenthusiastic about marching to the Holy Land. They had a frontier of their own to worry about, the eastern edge of the German world, where the river Elbe and the river Oder marked the boundary between Christian Saxony and the lands of the pagan Slavic peoples known collectively as the Wends. These peoples had not been converted. They worshipped their old gods, they raided across the border, and they sat on land that the Saxon and Danish nobles had long coveted. The Saxons put a proposal to Bernard. Rather than travel to the east, let them earn the same crusade indulgence by fighting the pagans on their own doorstep. Bernard agreed, and so did the Pope, who issued a formal letter in the spring of 1147, granting those who fought the Wends the same spiritual rewards as those who marched to Jerusalem. Bernard's own words on the subject have echoed down the centuries for their harshness. He declared that there should be no truce with these pagans until, as he put it, they were either converted or wiped out. It was a chilling sentiment from a man who had just been protecting Jewish communities in the Rhineland, and it shows how completely the category of enemy could shift the moral rules in the medieval mind. The Jews were to be preserved as witnesses. The pagan Wends, who held land the Saxons wanted, were offered conversion or destruction and nothing in between. So in the summer of 1147, while the great royal armies were still gathering for the march east, a separate crusade set out into the cold forests and marshes of the Baltic frontier. It was led by some of the most powerful men of northern Germany and Denmark, including a young Duke of Saxony named Henry, who would later be called Henry the Lion, and the seasoned border lord Albert, called the Bear, along with Danish kings and a clutch of archbishops who blessed the whole affair. The Wends, for their part, were led most ably by a prince named Niklot, who understood his enemies well and struck first, raiding into Christian territory before the Crusaders could fully assemble. The campaign that followed was, by any honest measure, a muddle. The crusading armies marched against the Wendish strongholds and laid siege to fortified places with names like Dobin and Demin, deep in the wet northern country. But the sieges dragged. The terrain was difficult, the supply lines were long, and the Wends defended themselves stubbornly. And then the whole enterprise ran into a difficulty that no amount of holy preaching could solve. Many of the German and Danish lords had no real interest in exterminating the Wends or even in converting them. What they wanted was the land and the tribute, the steady stream of payments that the Wends already owed to some of them. It is genuinely difficult to collect tribute from a people you have wiped out, and so the lords found themselves curiously reluctant to press the war to its preached conclusion. The result was a campaign that talked of holy extermination and practiced careful preservation. At Dobin, the siege ended not with conquest, but with a negotiated arrangement in which Niklot and his people agreed to a token acceptance of baptism that everyone involved understood to be meaningless. The Crusaders went home able to claim that they had won converts, while the Wends went on worshipping their old gods much as before, and the lords kept their tributaries intact. A contemporary chronicler of these lands, watching the whole performance, observed with dry disgust that the men who should have been the keenest to crush the pagans were the very ones who spared them. Precisely because the pagans were a useful source of income, the crusade against the Wends, in other words, was undone less by the enemy than by the bookkeeping. In strict military terms, the Wendish crusade achieved almost nothing in the short run. No great conquest followed, no mass conversion held, and the frontier remained much where it had been, and yet it would prove to be the small beginning of something very large. It was the opening move in what historians later called the Northern Crusades, the long campaign of German and Scandinavian expansion that would, over the following centuries, slowly push Christian rule and Christian settlement across the entire southern coast of the Baltic Sea. The lords of 1147 failed to convert or destroy the Wends, but they established the principle that the conquest of pagan neighbours could be holy work, and that principle would outlive them by hundreds of years. The Third Front opened far to the southwest, in the Iberian Peninsula, the long stretch of land that we now call Spain and Portugal. There, the situation was the reverse of the Baltic. The Christian kingdoms of the north had been pushing slowly southward for generations, reclaiming territory from the Muslim rulers who had held most of the peninsula since the 8th century. This long, slow process of reconquest was already underway, and it did not need a crusade to invent it. But the crusade gave it a new energy and, crucially, a new supply of fighting men, because the same indulgence was extended to those who fought the Muslims in the west. Several campaigns in Spain belonged to these years. Christian forces, often with the help of fleets from the Italian city of Genoa, struck at Muslim-held ports and cities along the Mediterranean coast, taking some of them after hard fighting. These were real successes, won by Spanish kings and counts with Crusader help, and they pushed the frontier of Christian Iberia outward in lasting ways. They are often forgotten in the larger story because they happened far from the Holy Land and far from the famous kings, but to the people of the peninsula they mattered enormously. And there was one episode in the West that stands out above the rest, both for its drama and for the fact that it succeeded so completely while the Great Eastern Expedition failed so badly. It involved not the kings and not the planned armies, but a fleet of crusaders from the cold northern shores of Europe, men from England and Flanders and the German coast, who had set out to sail the long way around to the Holy Land. Storms and chance and a Portuguese king's clever offer would divert them onto an entirely different target, a Muslim city at the mouth of a river on the Atlantic coast, and what they did there would become the one shining victory of the whole Second Crusade. That city was Lisbon, and its fall is a story worth telling on its own, the fortunate detour to Lisbon. While the kings of France and Germany were still mustering their land armies, a very different crusading force was gathering on the cold northern coasts of Europe. These were men who had chosen to reach the Holy Land by sea rather than by the long march overland, and they came from England, Normandy, Flanders, the Rhineland, and the lands along the North Sea. They were not led by kings. They were a loose and democratic sort of company, organised into groups under their own captains, bound together by sworn agreements about how they would share decisions and divide whatever they won. Their fleet was large, something close to 200 ships carrying many thousands of fighting men, and in the late spring of 1147 it set out down the coast of Europe, bound in theory for the eastern Mediterranean, by way of the long route around Spain. Sea travel in that age was at the mercy of wind and weather, and the fleet put in along the western coast of the Iberian Peninsula to wait out bad conditions and take on supplies. There, they found themselves in the young kingdom of Portugal, a realm that had only recently won its independence and was ruled by an energetic warrior king named Afonso Henriques, the first to bear the title King of Portugal. Afonso was deep in his own long struggle to push the Muslim rulers southward and to enlarge his new kingdom, and the arrival of a fleet full of armed and eager crusaders exactly when he needed fighting men must have seemed to him like a gift dropped from heaven. There was a particular prize Afonso had his eye on. Downriver, where the great river met the Atlantic, stood the city of Lisbon, a wealthy and well-defended Muslim town with strong walls and a large population. To take it would transform his kingdom. The king, working through the local bishop, approached the Crusaders with an offer. If they would stay and help him capture Lisbon, he would grant them the plunder of the city, the ransoms of its wealthy captives, and land for any who wished to settle. It was a tempting proposition, but it sparked a real argument among the Crusaders. Many had taken vows to fight in the Holy Land, not in Portugal, and some among them suspected the whole thing was a distraction that would line the Portuguese king's pockets at their expense. Others pointed out that fighting Muslims in Spain earned the very same indulgence as fighting them in Syria, and that the journey east could wait. After much debate, the argument for staying won out, and the fleet swung its strength behind the King of Portugal. The siege of Lisbon began on the first day of July in 1147, and it was a long and grinding affair that would last about 4 months. This was not a quick storming, but a patient strangling of a strong city. The Crusaders threw up earthworks and built siege engines, great machines for hurling stones at the walls, and tall wooden towers that could be rolled up to the ramparts. Their engineers, especially the men from the Rhineland and the lands along the coast, were skilled at this work, and they set about undermining the walls in the old way, digging tunnels beneath the foundations. The defenders fought back hard, making sorties out of the gates, burning the Crusaders' machines, and holding out through the heat of summer and into the autumn, hoping for relief that never came. As the months wore on, the situation inside the city grew desperate. Food ran short, disease spread, and the promised help from other Muslim rulers failed to arrive. The defenders, finally, opened negotiations. The terms were agreed. The city would surrender, the lives of the inhabitants would be spared, and they would be allowed to depart or to remain under the new rule, while their wealth would pass to the victors. On the 24th of October, 1147, after 17 weeks of siege, Lisbon surrendered and the Crusaders entered the city. What followed was uglier than the careful terms had promised. The agreement to spare the inhabitants and to keep order broke down almost at once, as such agreements often did when a long-besieged city finally fell and excited soldiers poured through its gates. There was looting and violence. The terms were honoured only in part, and the city suffered the cruelties that came so regularly at the end of a hard siege. It was not the clean and honourable victory that the chroniclers preferred to describe, and the men who had vowed to fight for their souls did not always behave like it in the moment of triumph. But the result, once the dust settled, was solid and lasting in a way that almost nothing else in this crusade would be. Lisbon passed permanently into Christian hands and into the Kingdom of Portugal, and it would in time become the capital of that kingdom and one of the great cities of Europe. Many of the Crusaders kept their side of the bargain and settled there rather than sailing on, building new lives in a city they had helped to take. And here is a detail that delights anyone who notices it. When the conquered city needed a new bishop to organise its church, the man chosen was an Englishman, a crusader named Gilbert of Hastings, who had come with the fleet and now stayed to govern the souls of a city on the Atlantic coast of Iberia, far from the country of his birth. An English priest became the first bishop of reconquered Lisbon, a small reminder of just how far and how strangely the people of the 12th century could travel. We know an unusual amount about this siege, and that too is a happy accident. One of the Crusaders, very likely an Anglo-Norman priest who was present through the whole campaign, wrote a detailed account of the conquest of Lisbon, describing the voyage, the arguments among the Crusaders, the negotiations with the king, and the long ordeal of the siege itself. It survives, and it gives historians a rare, close view of how one of these expeditions actually worked from the inside. The quarrels and the diplomacy and the grim mechanics of medieval siege warfare told by a man who watched it happen. The capture of Lisbon was, without any argument, the single clear and permanent success of the entire Second Crusade. It is worth dwelling on that fact. Because of everything the Crusade set out to do, this was the part that worked, and it worked precisely because it was the part no one had planned. A fleet blown off its intended course, a king with a local ambition, a chance meeting, and a practical bargain produced a lasting conquest, while the grand royal armies marching toward Jerusalem with all the blessings of the Pope and the preaching of Bernard would achieve nothing of the kind. There is a lesson buried in that contrast about the difference between elaborate intentions and lucky improvisation, though the men of the time were too busy to draw it. For all its solidity, though, Lisbon was a sideshow in the eyes of those who had launched the crusade. The heart of the whole enterprise, the reason Bernard had preached and the kings had taken the cross, was the recovery of ground in the Holy Land and the security of Jerusalem. And the instrument meant to accomplish that was the vast double army of France and Germany, now finally assembled and beginning its enormous journey overland toward the east. To understand what became of that great host, and why so much hope ended in so much misery, we have to leave the Atlantic coast behind and join the long columns of men, horses, and wagons as they set out across Europe, and to look closely at who exactly was marching, and how such a multitude could possibly feed and govern itself on the road. The great host on the road. In the early summer of 1147, the great land armies finally began to move. The Germans set out first, under King Conrad III, taking the well-worn road that ran down the valley of the river Danube, through the Kingdom of Hungary, and on toward the frontier of the Byzantine Empire. The French, under King Louis VII, followed a few weeks behind along much the same route. These were not two tidy columns of soldiers. They were enormous, sprawling masses of humanity on the move, and to picture the Second Crusade correctly, you have to picture not an army but something closer to a migrating nation, trailing for miles along the dusty roads of Central Europe. How large were they? The writers of the time, as usual, reached for numbers that strain belief, speaking of hundreds of thousands and even of a host beyond counting. The truth was almost certainly smaller, though still staggering for the age, Tens of thousands of fighting men in each army, and behind them a far larger crowd of people who carried no weapons at all. Medieval chroniclers were not in the business of careful counting, and a writer who wished to convey that an army was very large simply chose a very large number. What is certain is that the combined expedition was the greatest movement of people the West had attempted since the First Crusade, and feeding and governing it would have defeated far better organised men than these. This is a good moment to look closely at who these people actually were, because a crusading host was a slice of the whole of medieval society set in motion, and the differences between its members tell us a great deal about the world they came from. At the top rode the great men, the king and the dukes and counts and bishops, each surrounded by his own household of retainers, servants, cooks, clerks and grooms. These lords travelled in as much comfort as the road allowed, with tents, fine clothing, and supplies of good food and wine. They dressed in garments of fine wool, dyed in strong colours, trimmed with fur and sometimes with silk, for bright colour and costly cloth were the clearest signs of rank in an age that had no other way to advertise it. They ate white bread, roasted and spiced meats, and drank wine, and even on campaign they expected to dine far better than the men who marched beneath them. Below the great lords came the knights, the mounted warriors who were the heart of any medieval army. A knight was an expensive creature. He needed a trained war horse, or several, a coat of mail made of thousands of small iron rings, a helmet, a shield, a sword, and a lance, and all of this cost a small fortune that only a man with land or a generous patron could afford. Over his mail he wore a cloth surcoat, useful for keeping the sun off the metal and for displaying the marks by which men knew one another in the chaos of battle. The whole structure of society in their homelands was arranged to produce and support these armoured riders, with land granted to a man in exchange for his service as a knight, and the knights of France and Germany regarded themselves, with some justice, as the finest soldiers in the world. Beneath the knights marched the great mass of ordinary fighting men, the foot soldiers, the archers and crossbowmen, the sergeants who fought on horseback but lacked a knight's rank. These men wore what they could afford, a padded jacket or a simpler mail shirt if they were lucky, more often just a tunic of coarse undyed wool, leather shoes and a cap. Their food was the food of the common people, dark bread of rye or barley, a thick pottage of beans and whatever vegetables could be found, salted or smoked meat and dried fish when it could be had, hard cheese, and ale or watered wine to drink. They slept on the ground, carried their own gear, and bore the heaviest share of the suffering when supplies ran short, which they often did. And then, swelling the host to its enormous size, came everyone else. There were squires and servants by the thousand, blacksmiths and carpenters and armourers to keep the equipment in repair, merchants who followed the army to sell it goods, and clergy at every level. For the crusade was a religious act, and priests travelled with it to say mass, hear confession, and tend the dying. There were women too, from great ladies like Queen Eleanor and the noble women of her household down to the wives, laundresses, and camp followers who attended any large body of men on the move. And there were the genuine pilgrims, the poor and the devout who had taken the cross not as soldiers but as penitents, walking east in hope of saving their souls, carrying little and depending on charity. All of these people, the powerful and the humble, the armoured and the barefoot, moved together in one vast, slow, hungry column. Feeding such a multitude was the problem that overshadowed everything, and it was never truly solved. An army of this size could not carry enough food to sustain a journey of thousands of miles. It had to buy supplies along the way, from the towns and markets of the lands it passed through, and this required careful agreements with the rulers of those lands, the King of Hungary, and above all, the Byzantine Emperor, whose territory the Crusaders had to cross. When markets were opened and prices were fair, the host moved peacefully. When markets were closed or prices were raised or the locals fled with their grain, the soldiers turned to foraging, which is a polite word for taking what they needed from the countryside by force. This was the source of endless trouble, and it began almost at once. A column of tens of thousands of armed and hungry men passing through a region, even a friendly Christian region, was a disaster for the people who lived there. Crops vanished, livestock disappeared, and quarrels over prices and supplies flared into violence. The Germans, who went first, left a trail of friction and damaged trust behind them as they marched through the Balkans toward Constantinople. The local people, who had seen Crusaders before, grew wary and resentful, and the Byzantine authorities watched the approaching host with mounting alarm. By the time the French followed along the same road, they found a population already soured by the army ahead of them, and their own discipline was not always better. There is something almost touching and almost absurd in the gap between the spiritual grandeur of the enterprise and the grubby reality of the road. These were men who believed they were marching to do the work of God, who had wept at Bernard's preaching and sewn the cross to their breasts in a fever of devotion. And here they were, squabbling with Balkan villagers over the price of bread, trampling fields, and arriving at the gates of the greatest Christian city in the world already half-starved and wholly out of temper. The journey was not yet a disaster, but the seeds of disaster were everywhere visible, in the lack of supply, the lack of discipline, the lack of any single commander who could control the whole mass, and the steadily worsening relations with the empire whose help they would soon desperately need. For ahead of them lay Constantinople, the queen of cities, and its clever, cautious emperor, Manuel Komnenos, who regarded the arrival of these vast Western armies not as the answer to a prayer, but as a fresh and dangerous problem to be managed. The meeting between the Crusaders and the Byzantines would set the tone for everything that followed in the East, and it would be poisoned from the start by suspicion on both sides. To that uneasy encounter at the edge of Europe and Asia we now turn. Constantinople and cold manners. When the Crusaders came at last to Constantinople, even the proudest among them fell briefly silent. Nothing in the West prepared a traveller for that city. It was the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the surviving eastern half of the old Roman world, and it had stood for 800 years as the largest, richest, and most magnificent Christian city on earth. Its triple walls ran for miles, its harbours were crowded with ships from every sea, its churches blazed with gold and coloured marble, and its markets overflowed with goods that the rough lords of France and Germany had never imagined. The Crusaders gaped at it, and then, almost in the same breath, they began to resent it. For there is no envy quite so sharp as the envy of poor warriors for a rich and clever city they cannot understand. The man who ruled this city was the Emperor Manuel Komnenos, and he is one of the more interesting figures of the whole story. He was young, energetic, well-educated, and a capable soldier in his own right, but he sat in a position of real difficulty. To the east lay the Turks, who had taken much of Asia Minor from his empire over the previous century. To the west lay the rising powers of Latin Christendom, who were nominally his fellow Christians but whom he had every reason to distrust. He remembered, as all Byzantines did, that some of the leaders of the First Crusade had turned out to be as dangerous to the empire as any Muslim enemy, and that one of them had later returned to make outright war on Byzantine soil. Now 2 more Western kings were marching toward him with armies larger than anything the First Crusade had fielded, and Manuel's first concern was not the liberation of the Holy Land, but the safety of his own capital and his own throne. There was a particular grievance that poisoned the air, and it deserves a clear explanation, because it would echo for the rest of the Crusade and beyond. Manuel had recently come to terms with the Turks who ruled the interior of Asia Minor, the sultanate based around the inland city the Westerners called Iconium. He had a truce with them. From the Byzantine point of view, this was simple common sense. The emperor could not fight everyone at once, and a quiet eastern frontier let him deal with the more immediate problem of the huge crusading armies pouring into his lands. But to the Crusaders, who had come all this way precisely to fight those Turks, the news that the Christian emperor was at peace with the enemy looked like nothing less than betrayal. They began to whisper that Manuel was secretly in league with the Muslims against them, and that whisper, once started, never died. The Germans arrived first, in the early autumn of 1147, and their stay outside the walls was tense from the beginning. There were skirmishes between German soldiers and the local population, disputes over supplies, and the usual ugliness that followed a large army camped near a wealthy city. It did not help that a violent storm and flood struck the German camp on the low ground outside the walls, sweeping away tents, supplies and men, and confirming the soldiers in their gloomy conviction that everything in this strange land was against them. King Conrad and Emperor Manuel were in fact connected by marriage, for Manuel had wedded a German noblewoman who was Conrad's relation by marriage, but even this family tie did little to warm the dealings between them. Manuel wanted one thing above all, to get the German army out of Europe and across the water into Asia as fast as possible, and in this at least both rulers agreed. The Germans were ferried across the narrow strait that divides the continents and set loose into Asia Minor. Then the French came, in the middle of autumn, and with them came an even deeper current of hostility toward the Byzantines. Some of the French leaders had arrived already primed to think the worst of the empire, and the news of Manuel's truce with the Turks lit them up with anger. There was loose talk, among the more hot-headed, of abandoning the crusade altogether and simply attacking Constantinople itself, seizing the great city and its wealth for Christendom. One of the bishops travelling with the army is said to have urged exactly this, arguing that the treacherous Greeks deserved nothing better. King Louis, to his credit, refused to consider it. He had taken the cross to free the Holy Land and to cleanse his own soul, not to make war on fellow Christians, and whatever his faults, he held to that purpose. The wild proposal came to nothing, but the fact that it could be seriously raised tells you how badly relations had already broken down. Manuel handled the French as he had handled the Germans, with a careful mixture of courtesy, gifts, and firm pressure to keep moving. He entertained Louis with the splendour of his court, supplied the army with markets, and used every diplomatic art to hurry it across the strait and out of his territory. He also wanted assurances, oaths from the Western leaders concerning any former imperial lands they might recover, the same kind of bargaining that had soured the First Crusade. The negotiations were stiff and mistrustful on both sides. The Crusaders thought the emperor was milking them, deceiving them, and possibly plotting their destruction. The emperor thought the Crusaders were dangerous, greedy barbarians who might at any moment turn on him. Both views had some truth in them, which is usually the worst kind of misunderstanding to have. In the end, the French too were carried across into Asia, and now the whole enormous enterprise stood on the threshold of the truly dangerous country. Beyond the narrow band of coast that the Byzantines still held lay the interior of Asia Minor, a vast, dry, broken landscape of mountains and high plains that the Turks now controlled. It was hostile ground in every sense. The land itself was harsh, water was scarce, and the Turkish horsemen who roamed it were among the most effective light cavalry in the world, masters of the sudden ambush and the feigned retreat, perfectly suited to harassing a slow, heavy Western army that depended on its supplies. The Byzantines, who knew this country well, gave the Crusaders advice, and the quality of that advice, and whether it was given in good faith, became another bitter quarrel. There was a safer route, longer and slower, that hugged the coast where Byzantine fortresses still offered some protection and supply. There was a more direct route inland, faster on the map but far more exposed to the Turks and the desert. The Germans, marching ahead, chose to strike inland by the direct road, the same road the First Crusade had taken to its famous early victory half a century before. They were confident, perhaps overconfident, trusting that the path that had worked for their grandfathers would work for them. It would not. The world had changed since the First Crusade. The Turks had learned hard lessons about how to fight these Western invasions, and they were waiting. The Byzantine guides, who led the German column into the interior, would later be accused of treachery, of deliberately abandoning the army or leading it astray, though whether through malice or through the ordinary confusion of such a march is impossible now to say. What is certain is that Conrad's great host marched into the dry heart of Anatolia, short of water and short of food, strung out along a difficult road, and that somewhere ahead of it the Turkish horsemen were gathering. The first and worst of the Crusades' military disasters was about to fall, and it would shatter the German army in a single terrible day before the kings had so much as glimpsed the Holy Land, the killing ground of Anatolia. Conrad's army pushed inland from the Byzantine frontier in the second half of October 1147, aiming to cross the interior of Asia Minor by the direct road. From the start, the march went wrong. The Germans had not carried enough supplies for so long and so barren a route, and the great crowd of non-combatants who travelled with them, the pilgrims and servants and camp followers, slowed the column and ate through the dwindling food. As they advanced into the dry country, water grew scarce. The heat and dust wore the men down, and the army strung itself out over the road in a long, vulnerable line. And all the while, unseen or barely seen, the Turkish horsemen were shadowing them, watching, waiting for the column to weaken. The blow fell near the place called Dorylaeum, in a river valley that the men of the First Crusade had made famous by winning a great victory there 50 years before. On the 25th of October, the Turks struck. They came in the manner that made them so deadly. Mounted archers riding in close, loosing volleys of arrows, then wheeling away before the heavy western knights could close with them. The German cavalry charged and found nothing to charge. The Turks simply scattered before them, and then reformed to strike again from another direction. Meanwhile, the foot soldiers and the unarmed pilgrims, exhausted and packed together, had no answer at all to the arrows raining down on them. The killing went on, and the German army, the great host that Conrad had led out of the empire with such hope, came apart. It was not a battle so much as a slaughter and a rout. The losses were appalling. The chroniclers say that the larger part of the army was destroyed that day, and in the chaotic flight that followed, and while their exact figures cannot be trusted, the scale of the disaster is not in doubt. King Conrad himself was wounded, and the survivors who could still move turned and fled back the way they had come, harried all the way. What staggered back to the Byzantine frontier was a fraction of what had marched out, a broken remnant of cold, hungry, demoralized men around a wounded king. The German contribution to the crusade had been shattered in a single day, before it had come within hundreds of miles of the Holy Land, by an enemy it had hardly managed to touch. The wreckage of the German army eventually fell in with the French, who had been following behind, and the two royal forces, now reduced to one, decided to continue together along the safer coastal road. They made their way down toward the western edge of Asia Minor and the old city of Ephesus, where Conrad, still unwell, parted from the others to recover. The French, with the German survivors among them, pressed on into the difficult winter country, and here the second great disaster awaited them. In January of 1148, the army had to cross a mountain called Cadmus, by way of a high and dangerous pass. The plan was sensible enough. The vanguard, the leading division of the army, was to climb to the top of the pass and make camp there, holding the high ground so that the rest of the army and the long, slow baggage train could come up safely behind. But the commander of the vanguard, eager to find a better campsite further on, disobeyed the plan and pushed on over the crest and down the far side, leaving the heights undefended. A gap opened in the army. The main body with the king and the baggage was still toiling up the steep and broken path, strung out and disordered, when the Turks fell on them in exactly the worst possible place. In the narrow defiles of the mountain, the heavy French cavalry could not manoeuvre, the baggage animals panicked, and men and horses were driven over the edges or cut down where they stood. The losses in men, horses and supplies were terrible. King Louis himself came within a breath of death. Separated from his bodyguard in the confusion, unrecognised by the enemy in the press, he is said to have scrambled up onto a rock and defended himself with his sword through the desperate fighting, surviving the night by luck and by the fact that the Turks did not know they had the King of France within their reach. By morning the army was a battered, frightened thing, and its faith in its own leaders had been badly shaken. After Cadmus, Louis made one of the few wise decisions of the whole expedition. Recognizing that his own commanders could not keep order on the march, he handed the discipline of the army on the road over to the Knights Templar, the warrior monks whose training and obedience made them the steadiest soldiers present. Under their direction, the column tightened up, the men learned to hold formation under harassment, and the army managed to fight its way through the remaining hostile country to the coast. It was a small flash of competence in a campaign that had shown precious little, and it probably saved the French from sharing the fate of the Germans. The survivors reached the port city of Anatolia on the southern coast, and there the expedition reached its lowest and most shameful point. The city could not supply the great mass of starving men who arrived at its gates. Food was scarce, and what there was cost ruinous prices. The surrounding country swarmed with Turks, and disease moved through the crowded, weakened ranks. There were not enough ships to carry everyone onward by sea, and the journey by land was a death sentence. Faced with this, King Louis and the nobles and knights, the men with money and rank, took ship for the Holy Land and sailed away, leaving behind the bulk of the foot soldiers and the poor pilgrims, the very people who had followed the cross with the purest motives and the fewest resources. What happened to those abandoned thousands is grim. Some tried to continue overland and were killed or captured by the Turks. Many died of hunger and sickness outside the walls of Italia. It was a betrayal of the ordinary crusaders by their leaders, and it sat uneasily on the conscience of the age, though there was little anyone could have done to feed them all. The dream that had begun with Bernard tearing his habit into crosses on a Burgundian hillside had come to this, a king sailing away from a plague-ridden harbour, while the people he had inspired starved on the shore behind him. By the time Louis reached the coast of Syria in the spring of 1148, the military reality of the Second Crusade was already settled, though no one would admit it yet. The two great armies of the West, which had set out with such numbers and such confidence, had been reduced to a shadow of themselves, not by a single decisive defeat in open battle, but by the slow, relentless attrition of the march, the ambushes in the passes, the failures of supply, the disease, and the divisions among the leaders. The Turks of Asia Minor, fighting in their own country in their own way, had done more to wreck the crusade than the great Muslim lords of Syria would ever have to do. And yet the kings had survived, and they had reached the east at last, and the purpose that had drawn them remained. There were still soldiers, still treasure, still the prestige of two crowned kings come to fight for the cross. The crusade was wounded, but not finished. King Louis sailed into the harbour of one of the greatest of the Crusader cities, Antioch, where the ruler who waited to greet him was no stranger but a kinsman of his own wife, the queen who travelled at his side. And it was there, in the palaces of Antioch, that the crusade would suffer a wound of an entirely different kind, one inflicted not by Turkish arrows, but by pride, suspicion, and a quarrel inside a royal marriage. To Antioch, and to the queen at the centre of the storm, we now turn. Antioch and the queen. When King Louis sailed into the harbour below Antioch in the spring of 1148, he came not to a city of strangers but to a kind of homecoming, for the man who ruled there was bound to him by marriage. Antioch was governed by Raymond of Poitiers, the prince of the city, and Raymond was the uncle of Queen Eleanor, the younger brother of her late father. He was, by every account, a striking figure, tall and handsome, charming, an experienced and capable soldier, and still in the vigour of his middle years. He received the king and queen with great splendour, lodging them in luxury, and for a brief while the battered French found themselves resting in comfort among friends and kin in one of the finest cities of the East. But Raymond had not opened his treasury and his palaces out of simple family feeling. He had a war to fight, and he saw in the arrival of the King of France the answer to his prayers. The great danger to Antioch, the threat that kept Raymond awake at night, was Nur ad-Din, the rising lord of Aleppo, whose power lay just to the east of Raymond's borders and grew stronger every year. If the crusade was to do any real good in the east, Raymond argued, it should strike at the true source of the danger. It should march on Aleppo, break Nur ad-Din's strength, and perhaps recover the lost ground around Edessa, the very loss that had started the whole crusade in the first place. This was, by a wide margin, the most sensible military plan anyone would propose during the entire expedition. It aimed at the actual enemy, in the actual place where the crusade had been provoked. Louis would not hear of it. The king's mind was fixed on Jerusalem. He had taken the cross above all to complete his pilgrimage to the holy places and to cleanse his soul of the sin that haunted him, and he felt he could not, in conscience, turn aside to fight a campaign in the north until he had first prayed at the Holy Sepulchre. There was also, beneath this piety, a colder calculation and a growing unease, because the longer the French stayed in Antioch, the clearer it became that something was happening between the prince and the queen that the king did not like at all. Eleanor of Aquitaine and her uncle Raymond took to one another at once, and it is not hard to see why. They came from the same sunlit world of southern France, spoke the same southern tongue, and shared a taste for the refined and pleasure-loving culture of their homeland, a culture that the dour and monkish Louis had never really belonged to. In the elegant courts of Antioch, Eleanor was in her element in a way she had not been since leaving home, and she and Raymond spent a great deal of time in one another's company. The chroniclers of the age, who were almost all hostile to Eleanor, hinted darkly that this closeness went beyond what was proper between an uncle and a niece. Whether there was any truth to those whispers, no one can now know. The writers who recorded them had their own reasons to blacken the Queen's name, and the charge of scandal was the easiest weapon to hand. What is certain, and what mattered, is that Eleanor threw her support firmly behind her uncle's plan to attack Aleppo, and set herself against her husband's determination to leave for Jerusalem. This was the spark that turned a strategic disagreement into a personal catastrophe. When Louis announced that he would take the army south to Jerusalem, Eleanor refused to go. She wished to remain in Antioch, and to see the campaign against Aleppo carried out. And when her husband insisted, she struck at the root of their union itself. She raised the matter of their marriage, pointing out that she and Louis were related by blood within the degrees that the Church forbade, both being descended from a common royal ancestor a few generations back. On those grounds, she suggested, their marriage might not be lawful at all and could be dissolved. It was a devastating thing for a queen to say to a king, and it laid bare how completely the bond between them had broken. Louis's response was not the response of a confident man. Wounded, jealous, and humiliated, he refused to leave his wife behind in the company of the uncle he had come to mistrust. So he resolved the matter by force. He had Eleanor seized and removed from Antioch, taking her with him out of the city, against her will, to continue south toward Jerusalem. Raymond, his hospitality thrown back in his face and his great plan rejected, withdrew his support from the crusade entirely. The chance to strike at Aleppo, the one target that might have given the whole expedition meaning, was gone, sacrificed to the pride and suspicion of a failing marriage. It is worth pausing on the size of this mistake, because it is one of those moments where private passions decided public history. Raymond's plan had everything to recommend it. It aimed at the real enemy, it had the support of the local ruler who knew the ground, and it addressed the original cause of the crusade. Against it stood nothing but the king's religious stubbornness and his jealousy over his wife. And the king's view prevailed, not because it was wiser, but because he was the king and Eleanor was his to command. The army marched away from the one objective that made sense, and toward a fate that no one yet foresaw. As for Eleanor, this bitter episode at Antioch was the beginning of the end of her first marriage, but very far from the end of her remarkable life. A few years after the crusade limped home, she and Louis did indeed have their marriage annulled, on exactly the grounds of blood kinship she had raised in Antioch, and within a matter of weeks, the freed queen married a younger and more vigorous man, Henry of Anjou, who soon became King of England. Eleanor thus became queen of 2 countries in succession, and she would be the mother of 2 future English kings, including the famous warrior king known as the Lionheart. The woman whom the chroniclers tried to shame for her conduct on crusade went on to become one of the most powerful and long-lived figures of the entire age, outliving nearly everyone who had judged her. But all of that lay in the future. In the spring of 1148, the immediate result of the quarrel at Antioch was simply that the crusade had thrown away its best opportunity and arrived in Jerusalem divided, embittered, and badly reduced in strength. The army that reached the Holy City was a fraction of the host that had set out from Europe. The Germans had been destroyed in Anatolia, the poor had been abandoned at Italia, and now the leadership itself was fractured by the falling out at Antioch. There was not enough left to mount the grand campaign that had been imagined back in France, and the leaders knew it, even if they would not say it aloud. Still, the kings had reached the Holy Land, and the prestige of their presence demanded that something be attempted. The rulers of the Crusader states, who had their own pressing needs and their own ideas about where danger lay, now joined with the visiting kings to decide what this great, costly, and already half-wrecked expedition would actually do with itself. They gathered in council near the coast, the local lords and the kings from across the sea, to choose a target worthy of so much sacrifice. The decision they reached would prove to be the strangest and most self-defeating of the entire crusade, and to understand how grown and experienced men could choose so badly, we must sit in on the council where the fate of the expedition was sealed, the council at Acre. In the high summer of 1148, the leaders of the crusade gathered for a great council near the coastal city of Acre in the kingdom of Jerusalem. It was, on the surface, an impressive assembly. There sat King Louis VII of France. There sat King Conrad III of Germany, who had recovered from his wounds and made his way to the Holy Land by sea, helped on his way by the very Byzantine emperor the Crusaders so distrusted. There sat the young King Baldwin III of Jerusalem, eager to prove himself, alongside the powerful nobles of his kingdom, the Patriarch of Jerusalem, and the masters of the great military orders, the Templars and the Hospitallers. 2 kings from across the sea, and the assembled leadership of the Crusader states, all in one room, all charged with deciding how the enormous effort and sacrifice of the past 2 years should finally be spent. The question before them was simple to state and hard to answer. Against which target should the crusade march? There were several possibilities, and each had its arguments. There was Aleppo, far to the north, the seat of Nur ad-Din's power and the truest source of danger to the whole Christian presence in the east. There was the ruined county of Edessa, whose loss had started everything, though it was now so thoroughly destroyed and so deep in hostile territory that retaking and holding it was barely imaginable. There was Ascalon, a strong fortress city to the south, held by the rulers of Egypt, a constant thorn in the side of the kingdom of Jerusalem. And there was Damascus, the great and wealthy city to the northeast, one of the oldest and most famous cities in the world. They chose Damascus. And to understand why this was such a remarkable choice, you have to understand what Damascus actually was at that moment, because it was very nearly the worst target on the entire list. Damascus was a major Muslim power, true, but it was ruled by its own dynasty, independent of Nur ad-Din, and that dynasty was frightened of Nur ad-Din. The Lord of Damascus had no wish to be swallowed up by the rising power of Aleppo, and so, for years, Damascus had maintained a friendly understanding, even a working alliance, with the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The Christians and the Damascenes had a shared interest in keeping Nur ad-Din from uniting all of Muslim Syria under one hand. Damascus was, in plain terms, the Crusaders' most useful neighbour and a buffer against their most dangerous enemy. To attack it, therefore, was to attack a friend in order to make an enemy. If the Crusaders took Damascus, they would gain a rich prize. But if they tried and failed, they would shatter the one alliance that kept the Muslim world divided, and they would drive Damascus straight into the arms of Nur ad-Din, handing him exactly the unity he had been working his whole life to achieve. It was the kind of plan that looks worse the longer you study it, and the council studied it at considerable length before deciding to go ahead anyway. So why did they do it? There were reasons, even if none of them was good enough. Damascus was close to Jerusalem, far closer than distant Aleppo, which meant the army could actually reach it without another murderous march through hostile country. It was immensely wealthy, and the prospect of its plunder was tempting to men who had come a very long way for very little. The local barons of Jerusalem had long dreamed of adding Damascus to their kingdom, and they pressed that ambition hard. The visiting kings, for their part, wanted a glorious and achievable victory to show for their enormous effort, something to carry home and to set against the disasters of the journey. A great city near at hand, full of riches, seemed to offer exactly that. There was also a colder calculation buried in the decision. Some argued that the friendship of Damascus could not last forever, that sooner or later the city would fall under Nur ad-Din's control no matter what the Christians did, and that it was therefore better to seize it now, while the crusade had the strength, than to wait and let it be lost to the enemy. There was a grain of sense in this. The trouble was that it gambled the certain present advantage of an allied buffer state against the uncertain future hope of conquest, and it assumed that the conquest would succeed. If the gamble failed, the Crusaders would lose the friend without gaining the city, the worst of all possible outcomes, and the Crusaders, as it turned out, were not nearly as strong as they imagined. It is tempting, looking back, to see the choice of Damascus as simple stupidity, but that is too easy. The men in that council were not fools. They were experienced soldiers and rulers who had spent their lives in this world. The decision was bad, but it was bad in the way that committee decisions are often bad, the product of too many competing interests, too much wishful thinking, and too little willingness to face an unwelcome truth. The local barons wanted Damascus for their kingdom. The kings wanted a victory for their pride. Everyone wanted something achievable after so much failure. And so they talked themselves into the one campaign that, even if it succeeded, would not strike at the real enemy, and that, if it failed, would make the real enemy stronger than ever. The absence of Raymond of Antioch and his sound plan to attack Aleppo, thrown away in the quarrel over the queen, hung over the whole proceeding, though no one was eager to mention it. There was, too, a deeper problem that the choice of target could not fix. The Crusade simply did not have the strength it had set out with. The grand vision in France had assumed two mighty armies arriving intact to overwhelm any enemy. What had actually reached the Holy Land was a remnant, the survivors of the passes and the plagues and the abandonment at the coast, joined now to the modest forces the Crusader states could muster. To besiege and take a city the size of Damascus, defended by a determined population and within reach of relief from Nur ad-Din, was a far more demanding task than the reduced army was equipped for. The leaders chose an objective, scaled to their ambitions rather than to their means, which is a habit that has ruined many campaigns before and since. And so the decision was made, and the army prepared to march on Damascus. There was, briefly, a kind of energy in it, the relief of finally having a clear purpose after months of frustration, and the leaders persuaded themselves that the rich and famous city would soon be theirs. The kings of France and Germany, the king of Jerusalem, the great lords and the warrior monks, all of them turned their faces toward the green gardens and the high walls of Damascus, confident that the long ordeal of the crusade was about to be redeemed by a single glorious conquest. What followed would be neither glorious nor long. The siege of Damascus, the supposed climax of the whole vast enterprise, the thing for which a pope had written, a saint had preached, 2 kings had marched, and tens of thousands had died on the roads of Asia, would last a grand total of 4 days. It would unravel so quickly, and through decisions so baffling, that men have argued about it ever since, with dark talk of bribery and betrayal woven through every account. The crusade had survived the loss of Edessa, the ambushes of Anatolia, the quarrel at Antioch, and its own poor judgment at the council. It would not survive the 4 days outside Damascus. To those 4 days, where everything finally came apart, we now go. 4 days outside Damascus. The army marched out toward Damascus in the last week of July, 1148, and at first the campaign seemed to justify the council's confidence. Damascus did not sit naked on an open plain. It was surrounded on its western side by the Ghouta, a vast belt of orchards and gardens watered by the river that ran down from the mountains, divided into countless small plots by mud walls and irrigation channels and shaded by fruit trees. This green country was the city's larder and its first line of defence, a maze in which an attacker could be ambushed at every turn, but in which there was also abundant water and food. The Crusaders came at the city through these gardens, and they fought their way through hard fighting against the defenders who contested every wall and ditch. The first day went well enough. The Crusaders pressed through the orchards, drove the Damascene forces back, and reached the river on the western edge of the city, securing access to water and to the supplies of the gardens. They pushed the defenders all the way back toward the walls. For a moment, watching from the city, the people of Damascus had real cause for fear, and their commander, the seasoned old ruler of the city, sent out urgent calls for help in every direction. He sent to Nur ad-Din in Aleppo, and to Nur ad-Din's brother in Mosul, begging them to come quickly and relieve the city, the very thing the Crusaders should have wanted to prevent. The gathering of Muslim Syria into a single force was now being summoned into being by their own attack, exactly as the friendship of Damascus would have prevented. The defenders did not give up. They fought on in the orchards, harassing the besiegers, slipping through the maze of garden walls to strike and vanish. And they held the western approaches stubbornly enough to keep the Crusaders from breaking into the city. Day passed into day, and the early momentum slowed. And then, on the second or third day of the siege, the Crusader leaders made the decision that destroyed everything, a decision so strange that men have argued about it from that day to this. They abandoned their strong position in the well-watered gardens on the western side and moved the entire army around to the eastern and southern side of the city, out onto the open plain. The reasoning, such as it was, ran like this. The orchards offered the defenders too much cover and made it impossible to bring the full weight of the army against the walls. On the open eastern side, by contrast, the ground was clear, the army could deploy properly, and the walls there were said to be weaker and less well defended. In theory, it was a place where a direct assault might break in. In practice, it was a death trap. The eastern side of Damascus was dry, barren ground with no river, no orchards, and no water. The army had given up the one position that supplied it with everything it needed and marched out onto open land where it could find nothing. And the walls on that side, far from being weak and undefended, proved strong and stoutly held, for the Damascenes had used the time to reinforce them and to bring in more fighting men. The Crusaders now found themselves baking on a waterless plain, unable to break through, with their supplies cut off behind them in the gardens they had foolishly abandoned. Within a day or two, the position had become impossible. How could experienced soldiers make so disastrous a move? The sources are full of dark explanations, and they cannot all be true, but they point to the same rotten core. The loudest accusation was treachery. It was said that some of the local barons of Jerusalem had been bribed by the Damascenes, paid to give bad advice, to argue for the move to the eastern side, knowing it would doom the siege. There were even stories that the gold paid in the bribe turned out, in a final insult, to be counterfeit, leaving the traitors with neither honour nor payment. Whether any of this is true is impossible to prove, but there is a more sober explanation that runs beneath the lurid one, and it is just as damning. The Crusaders had begun to quarrel over the spoils before they had won them. The question of who would actually rule Damascus once it was taken, which of the great lords would receive this golden prize, set the leaders against one another. The barons of Jerusalem, the visiting kings, and the various claimants all wanted the city, and their jealousies poisoned every decision. A leader who suspected that the conquest would only enrich a rival had little reason to press the siege wholeheartedly. In an army divided over who would own the prize, no one could be trusted to pursue the prize with a single mind, and so the whole effort dissolved into suspicion and half measures. Treachery, real or imagined, was only the sharpest expression of a division that ran all the way through the camp. While the Crusaders sat dying of thirst on the eastern plain, the news arrived that sealed their fate. Nur ad-Din and his brother were marching with their armies to relieve Damascus, and they were close. The Crusaders now faced the prospect of being caught between the strong walls of the city in front of them and a fresh, powerful, relieving army at their backs, while they themselves were short of water, low on supplies, and bitterly divided. There was nothing to do but retreat, and quickly, before the trap closed entirely. So, after just 4 days, the great siege of Damascus was abandoned. The army that had set out to take the most famous city of Syria turned around and marched away without having breached its walls. The retreat was a wretched affair. As the Crusaders pulled back across the plain and through the country toward Jerusalem, the Turkish horsemen and the Damascene forces fell on their rear, harrying the column, picking off stragglers, and turning the withdrawal into a running ordeal. Men and horses died on the road back. The army that staggered into the kingdom of Jerusalem was beaten, exhausted, and humiliated, and it had nothing whatever to show for the whole enormous enterprise. The recriminations began at once and never really stopped. The Crusaders from Europe blamed the local barons for the treachery they were certain had occurred. The barons of Jerusalem blamed the arrogance and incompetence of the newcomers, who had blundered into a campaign they did not understand. Conrad blamed the men of Jerusalem. Louis blamed his own ill fortune. Everyone agreed that they had been betrayed by someone, because the alternative, that they had simply chosen a foolish target and then thrown away a winning position through their own divisions, was too painful to accept. The 4 days outside Damascus poisoned the trust between the Crusaders of the West and the Christians of the East for a generation, and that broken trust would have consequences of its own. There was no recovering from this. The whole point of the crusade had been to win some great success in the East, and the one great attempt had collapsed in less than a week through a combination of bad strategy, worse tactics, and rotten unity. Conrad, sick at heart, left the Holy Land within a few weeks and sailed for home, his crusade utterly empty of achievement. Louis lingered longer, spending months in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, praying at the holy places and doing his pilgrimage, but he attempted nothing more of any consequence, and in time he too sailed back to France. The Second Crusade, which had begun with such fervour on a hillside in Burgundy, ended not with a battle, but with a quiet, shamefaced sailing away. What remained was to count the cost, and the cost was very high indeed, not only in the lives and treasure that had been poured into the sand, but in the new and dangerous shape the East now took because of it. The failure outside Damascus would echo for decades, and to understand its true weight, we have to look at what it left behind, and at the man who would gather up its consequences and turn them into the ruin of the Crusader kingdom. The Long Shadow. When the news of the Damascus disaster reached Europe, it landed not as a defeat but as a kind of bewilderment. The First Crusade had succeeded against all odds, and that success had been understood as proof of God's favour. Now a far larger and better-led expedition, blessed by the Pope, preached by the holiest man in Christendom, and commanded by 2 crowned kings, had achieved nothing at all in the East. It had thrown away its armies on the roads of Asia and its honour outside the walls of Damascus, and it had come home empty-handed. To a deeply religious society, this was not just a military failure. It was a theological problem. If the crusade was God's work, how could God have allowed it to fail so completely? No one felt this question more sharply than Bernard of Clairvaux. He had staked his enormous authority on the crusade. He had told the crowds that it was the will of heaven, that those who went would have their sins washed away, that the cause could not fail because it was holy. And now it had failed about as badly as anything could. Bernard was left to explain the unexplainable, and the explanation he reached for was the only one available to him. The fault, he insisted, lay not in the cause but in the men who had carried it out. The crusade had failed because the crusaders were sinful, because their pride and greed and quarrelling had made them unworthy of the victory God would otherwise have granted. He set this argument down in writing, in a long work addressed to the Pope, defending the rightness of the cause while mourning the wickedness of those who had pursued it. It was the best he could do, but it satisfied few, and his last years were shadowed by the wreck of the great enterprise he had set in motion. The wider effect on Europe was a deep and lasting cooling of crusading enthusiasm. The fever that Bernard had raised so easily would not be raised again so easily. Decades would pass before another great crusade marched east, and when men did go again, they went with fewer illusions and more caution. The simple confidence of the First Crusade was gone for good, replaced by a wary awareness that holy purpose was no guarantee of victory, and that God, for reasons of his own, might let the cross go down to defeat. There was a poisonous legacy, too, in the relations between the Latin West and the Byzantine East. The Crusaders, unwilling to blame themselves, blamed the Greeks. They were certain that Emperor Manuel had betrayed them, that his truce with the Turks and his treacherous guides had doomed the army in Anatolia. The Byzantines, for their part, regarded the Western armies as the dangerous, destructive barbarians they had always suspected them to be. The mistrust ran deeper after the Second Crusade than before it, and it festered. 2 generations later, that festering hatred would help produce one of the most shameful episodes in the whole history of the Crusades, when a Western army, supposedly bound for the Holy Land, turned aside instead and sacked Constantinople itself, the greatest Christian city in the world, looting and burning the capital of their fellow Christians. The seeds of that catastrophe were watered by the bitterness of 1148, but the deepest and most damaging consequence of the Second Crusade was the one that played out in Syria, and it was the precise opposite of everything the Crusade had been meant to achieve. By attacking Damascus, the Crusaders had shattered the alliance that kept Muslim Syria divided. The Lord of Damascus had learned a hard lesson. He could no longer trust the Christians of Jerusalem to be his friends against the rising power of Aleppo, and so he turned, of necessity, toward the very power he had once feared. Within a few years of the failed siege, Nur ad-Din achieved without a fight what the Crusaders had handed him. In 1154, Damascus passed peacefully into his control, and for the first time the 2 great cities of Muslim Syria, Aleppo and Damascus, were united under a single ruler. The buffer was gone. The patient work of Nur ad-Din's life, the gathering of the divided Muslims into one purpose, was now far advanced, and the Crusaders had done more to help it than to hinder it. From this unification flowed everything that followed. Nur ad-Din, master of Syria, extended his reach toward Egypt, and it was through his campaigns there that a young officer in his service first rose to prominence. That officer's nephew was a man named Saladin, and after Nur ad-Din's death, Saladin gathered up the whole inheritance, uniting Egypt and Syria under one hand and surrounding the Crusader kingdom on every side. The Christians of the East now faced exactly the nightmare that the friendship of Damascus had once held at bay: a single great Muslim power, organized, motivated, and far stronger than any one Crusader state. The end came in 1187. Saladin met the army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem at a place called Hattin and destroyed it utterly, and within months he had taken Jerusalem itself, the holy city that the First Crusade had won with such bloodshed nearly 90 years before. The loss of Jerusalem shocked Christendom into launching the Third Crusade, the famous expedition of the great kings, among them the warrior son of that same Eleanor of Aquitaine, who had quarrelled with her husband in the palaces of Antioch. The threads of this story, once you pull them, run a long way forward, and much of that long chain of disaster for the Crusader states can be traced back to the 4 wasted days outside Damascus, when a divided army threw away the one neighbour that had kept its enemies apart. It is tempting to look at the Second Crusade and see only failure, and in the narrow sense that is exactly what it was. It accomplished almost nothing it set out to do. It cost enormous numbers of lives, and it left the Christian position in the East weaker than it had found it. The one solid gain, the capture of Lisbon, came from the part of the crusade that no one had planned, carried out by men who were never supposed to be there. But there is something more to be drawn from it than a simple verdict of failure, and it has to do with the gap between belief and reality. The men of the Second Crusade were not cowards or fools. They were brave, devout, and in many cases experienced. What they lacked was unity, sound judgment, and any honest accounting of their own strength against the world as it actually was. They were carried east on a wave of religious feeling so powerful that it swept aside hard questions of supply, strategy, and trust. And when that wave broke on the dry plain outside Damascus, the feeling could not save them. Faith had filled the roads of Europe with armed pilgrims, but faith alone could not feed an army, hold a coalition together, or choose a wise target. The crusade is a lesson, told across thousands of miles and tens of thousands of lives, in how much more there is to any great endeavour than the sincerity of those who begin it. And so the Second Crusade passed into history, remembered chiefly as the one that went wrong, the great effort that fell flat between the glory of the first and the drama of the third. The Pope who called it, the saint who preached it, the kings who marched it, all of them faded from the scene in the years that followed, carrying their disappointment with them. The Crusader states held on for another century, growing slowly weaker until the last of them was gone. But the man who had quietly profited from it all, the patient lord of Aleppo who had turned the Crusaders' own blunder into the foundation of a united Syria, had shown the way to everyone who came after. And the world he helped to make would long outlast the brief and bitter expedition that had unwittingly helped to build it. That is the full story of the Second Crusade, from the night Edessa fell to the long shadow it cast across the century that followed. Are you still awake? If you are, there is another quiet history waiting for you on the screen whenever you would like to keep the journey going. And if you enjoyed this one, feel free to like and subscribe, or to leave a thought down in the comments. For now, though, there is nothing left to do. Let your body settle and grow heavy, let your eyes close, and let yourself drift off to sleep. Good night, and sweet dreams.